Here is supposed to be a sacred resting place of our ancestors on the island of St. Eustatius.
Welcome to the podcast Reclaiming Our Stories, Restoring Our Ties. My name is Ulysses Lopes, and you are listening to the podcast series by the St. Eustatius African Burial Ground Alliance, a grassroots organization formed as a result of the protests against the excavations on the 18th century burial ground of enslaved Africans, the Golden Rock, that were started by a team of international archaeologists in June 2021 in St. Eustatius. In this podcast, you will learn about the journey of the Alliance, its vision, and the important role that the community of Statia, the Caribbean, and the great African diaspora serve in reclaiming our narrative, history, and identity, as well as restoring our ancestral dignity and spiritual ties. So today we will be speaking with Peggy King Jorde. She's a global expert in African burial ground protection and memorialization, working with descendants of communities determined to reclaim and honor burial sites threatened by cultural racism, development, or erasure. So, Peggy, tell us, what brought you to this work? Why is the work important to you? And why do you feel the African burial ground preservation is vital to us all?
Okay, well, I would say that what brought me to this work was how I grew up. I grew up in Southwest Georgia in the United States, and I was born into an American apartheid. So when I was born, there was segregation. And my first grade year was the first year of integration. And so I was the only Black child to go into a first grade class of a formerly all-white school in my town. And I grew up in a family that was very active in the civil rights movement. So I come from an activist background or a family of activist background, and I was inspired by the work that they did when I was younger. And so at some point, when I ended up in New York and I became involved with the preservation of the African burial ground in the city of New York, I was working for New York City's first African-American mayor, Mayor David Dinkins, and I was working in the Office of Construction and overseeing capital construction projects of all the cultural institutions in the city of New York. When I found out about the site that was near my office that the United States federal government was going to build on, and it had been formerly a burial site for upwards of 20,000 enslaved and free African people. So that really transformed and changed my life once I became involved with that project. And when I say involved, there was a bit of activism, working in city government, then eventually working with community and a lot of other people, whether it was archaeology. In other words, I'm just giving you the short version of that story. But when you ask the question, why preservation of these grounds are important, I always respond by saying that, at least in the American context, when you think about a community that has been deemed inhuman, a society that says a group of people, and in this case, enslaved African people, are inhuman, that they have no rights that any man need respect. In a conversation with an archaeologist, they say that what defines us as human is how we bury our dead, and that we pray over the dead, we say important words, poetry, pour libations, sing songs, place special objects. So imagine this community of people in a society that says that they are inhuman. And on the occasion that they lose a mother, a father, a sister, a brother, and that they are permitted by their oppressor to bury their dead, they would be engaging in an act reclaiming the humanity of that mother, brother, sister, or father. And that, in a society that says that you are not human and you have no rights, that would be a revolutionary act. It would be a revolutionary act of remembrance. And so those sites, for me, are sacred. Whether the bodies are there or not, they are sacred because those are places where we as a community and as descendants should remember the sites for what happened there and how we reclaimed our humanity.
Yeah, well, it sounds like you're definitely deeply rooted in this from young. So that's a good thing, a lot of experience. So could you describe the moment when the African burial ground of New York City came into your life? Like, who were you in that moment and how did you respond to this calling?
Well, I was a city employee. And quite frankly, the way that it was brought to my attention was that there was a man who was much older than me who worked for New York City Parks, and he was of German American heritage. And he considered himself a history buff. He was born and raised in New York City and he loved New York City, loved history. And he got a hold of a document which had been put together for the United States government describing this ground and what this ground was used for. And he shared this document with me and said, hey, I never knew this. We never learned this history when I was a child. And I'm shocked because in the American context, our history books always taught us that slavery was in the South and not in the North. And here we were in New York City. And so upon him bringing that information to me and me following up on the site and what was being planned for the site, I became more and more involved unofficially. And I say unofficially because I didn't have permission to do it, but it fueled my interest to see what our United States government was going to do in terms of the significance of this site. How were they going to respond? And so I became much more involved and did what I say color outside of the lines. I did things that I could have lost my job doing, but it clearly for me became a passion of how is it that my history that has been erased as a regular process, how is it that now we can recapture this history and be able to speak to it and have it show up in our urban landscape, in our cultural landscape? And, that's why I say that project changed my life, because suddenly in the field of construction and architecture and design, there was something that had a mission. It had, for me, a mission, and it meant something very deeply. And it was no longer about, you want to be famous because you're a great designer. It was more than that and deeply rooted in who I was and who my community was.
Well, it sounds like somewhat of the same reason why I also, started diving into my history as well,
Right.
You've been fed another narrative for so long and now seeing more evidence coming out, like you said, it sparks something in you to really dig into it further for yourself. So I
Right.
definitely can relate to that. As far as the first moment, or I would say the first burial ground, how does that moment compare with all the others that have come into your life since that first one?
Well, the New York African Burial Ground, really, which happened a little over 30 years ago, it was really the first monument of its kind in the United States. So the first national monument honoring enslaved and free African people, right? And it is a burial ground. The remains that were displaced by the federal building that went up are reburied immediately next to the building, which is where our monument is and the reburial site is. And what I tell people is that site and that project really set the bar. It broke ground on a number of issues for the community, a number of issues for government and how it is that they move forward on sites like that. Some of the things that I learned, which I find critical, is that archaeology is an interpretive discipline. It is one that if you control the cultural resources that are coming out of the ground, if they do an archaeological dig, then you are the one that's telling the story. You're interpreting it. So imagine if you have somebody digging up artifacts, bodies, archaeology sometimes is viewed as an act of violence because more often than not, the adverse impact has been against Black, brown, and indigenous people, whether it's through taking of artifacts or impacting the bodies of Black, brown, and indigenous people. It's rooted in colonialism. And so changing how we deal with archaeology in an ethical manner where it concerns Black and brown and indigenous people was critical. And the African burial ground in New York City started to change that because whoever is taking those things out of the ground, they are writing the stories. And so if they are not having a conversation with the descendant community, if they are not seeking consent on the part of the descendant community, that's problematic. So that project in New York has changed the conversation around that. It's also changed the conversation about what memorialization is, and particularly how the descendant community participates in the entire process of design, of telling our story, of how we want to show up in the landscape, how we want our stories told or conveyed in the landscape.
Yeah, that's one thing I hammered on in a few episodes as well. The one who controls the narrative really controls how people will view the history of another person. So that definitely is good that finally we are getting the chance and I would say opportunity to really tap into that and take over actually the narrative and actually share more what is the real history and all of the knowledge that we had from the ancestors.
Absolutely. And that the community needs to remember that you are empowered to help tell those stories. It's your story. It's your community story, right?
So what would you say is the most critical to your work in preventing historical erasure? And why is the engagement of the descendant community so crucial to this work?
Well, it is just that. What is critical is community engagement, because imagine if you have a site that has some importance, right, to the community. Maybe you have one or two people who are out there trying to get everybody's attention to say, hey, this is important, we should get behind it. The reality is, unless the community gets behind those voices, with any project, any effort, they're always going to be the few up at the top that are going to always be vigilant, and they're going to continue to fight the good fight. But they will need the help of the community, because oftentimes the sites that the African community or the African American community deals with, those sites are in the hands of other people who are empowered to run those sites. So you're coming to people who don't realize that there is an outstanding debt to reparative justice with a site they may have. So community engagement, it is incredibly important. Otherwise, there's no power behind it. If the community is not behind it, there's no power to help tell the story and move our efforts forward in telling our stories and incorporating it into our books, our libraries, and what it is that we're talking about in a society.
Correct. And in your line of work, could you then discuss the role of memorialization, its importance, and how it benefits the global community and our cultural landscape?
Yeah, I mean, memorialization takes many forms, right? So you can have a statue, you can have some other object to mark a particular place of importance. And then in some instances, you sometimes have sites that there's something already there that has nothing to do with your history. And there are communities who contact me and they are saying, well, how can we reclaim this? How can we mark this site? Because right now there's a parking lot there, and we want to tell the owners of this parking lot, we want to tell our story. So with the community, I would say with memorialization, what's important about that is, and for obvious reasons, you think it's important for your children and your children's children and the society as a whole to take into consideration your existence, your history, your contributions into society, just like anybody else who is celebrated in our cultural landscape. But memorialization sometimes can come in different forms. It can come in a statue, or it can come in just a place for you to sit or a space. But I think that what is ultimately important is the site and the presence and the power and the meaning will only live on if it is a memorial where the community feels that they have ownership, that they will use it, that they will occupy space. Can you imagine putting a statue up and nobody ever goes to see it?
Correct.
So if nobody ever goes to see it, you haven't really accomplished what you set out to do. Sometimes I was just so that I was with a community group this weekend, and there is a plantation owner who a descendant of a plantation owner who wanted to donate some land back to descendants. And beautiful piece of land. And one of the things that we talked about is members of the descendant community were saying, well, how are we going to raise money to build a building and do something, or a museum? And I just said, we were sitting below pine trees overlooking water, that their ancestors were oystermen. So they dug up oysters in that water. We were sitting in land. We were sitting on land in the woods where their ancestors had worked, had been beaten, had babies, had lived, had done whatever. Every inch of that plantation was a place where enslaved Black people lived, worked, and died. And so I said to them, you're occupying space by sitting here right now, overlooking water. You don't have a building here. The power in their ability to occupy land that their ancestors were forced to work, but now they're sitting at rest, overlooking a beautiful sight of water. That to me, again, was a revolutionary act. And I said, memorialization is not necessarily a physical building or thing. Sometimes memorialization, 3/4 of it for me, is what you do in that space, how you occupy that space, how your children will occupy that space, and what you say, do there. You don't have to have built anything there. But if your bodies are there, you are reclaiming that place as sacred. And it's not to say that you don't build anything or you don't put a memorial or signage, but it means that start from there. Start with, how will we use this place? How will we keep coming back day after day, month after month, to honor our ancestors, to remember, to reinterpret how we're going to carry this forward? That, for me, is vital to memorialization. And every community, even though the community can look like me, they can be brown like me, but every community has their own priorities. And they will tell their stories differently.
Yeah, because if you look at how Black history is being presented, it's again, you're being fed what you should remember and how you should go about everything.
Right.
So it's definitely needed in that space.
Right. They do.
Like you were saying about the community, then coming into this next question, how can the descendants be more proactive in their communities and begin to address cultural heritage preservation?
I think that by just going to some of the public events that are being organized. I think St. Eustatius is doing an incredible job in trying to engage the community, doing all kinds of activities. I mean, the fact that St. Eustatius has 2 sites that have now been designated under UNESCO, right? That is community activism. That was community coming forward and fighting the fight and making a case for what was critical and important to the larger island community, right? So when you ask, what can people do? Get involved, right?
Correct.
Look to the left, look to the right, look in your own communities. There may be some places that are important that didn't necessarily go back to the 18 or 1700s. It could have been 1960s that are important to you. And that those are stories that are critical. So it really is rooted in your vigilance in seeing the stories and looking at your children and thinking about, when I'm gone, what will they carry forward for the next generations? What kinds of things will they have? Because it's in their ability to feel rooted in the community that they will be strong about who they are, how they move through the world globally. And then also recognizing that our stories, my story in the States, the story on St. Eustatius, the story on St. Helena, the story anywhere else, we are all connected. It was all one big transatlantic construct. And we
Correct.
are the product of that, right? And, my hope is that we will continue to connect all of these stories so that we know and that we can paint this larger global picture.
Yeah. Well, I must say, like I've been telling my uncle a lot of times, there's definitely an uprise in our community. I would say as a nation, I like to refer to it as a nation because everyone has theirs. They
Yes,
just call us Black people, but we are together a nation because
right.
it's for no reason that the transatlantic slave trade happened to us as a nation.
Yeah.
So we definitely, I do see that shift and more awareness coming out. Thankful for the work that the Alliance is doing as well, you
Yeah.
know, um,
Yes.
stirring up
Definitely.
the scene here on St. Eustatius and all over where the diaspora is scattered, I would say. And with
Right.
every individual, whether it's through to the memorialization of statues or what maybe, even through music,
Yeah.
there's so
Absolutely.
many avenues where you find different information coming out these days. Social media platforms, you have these short videos with impactful history
Yeah.
lesson in just 30 seconds. And it
Yes.
blows people's mind that they
Right.
didn't get this in school. So like I say, I'm seeing a lot of information and uprising coming with our people. A lot are still in the dark, and I would say, like they say, sleep. But, with
Yeah.
more and more
Yeah.
organizations and individuals in the community definitely keep sharing this,
Right.
each one will teach one, and
Uh,
we will get that.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. And I think that, and you mentioned the Alliance, and let me tell you, I'm reminded of the civil rights movement, and it took people who were willing to step over a lot of different lines to really ring the bell and kind of wake people up. And it's not to say that people are lazy or anything. It's that people get busy with
yeah,
other things in their lives, right? So I would never think in terms of
correct.
beating yourself up, but it takes activism like that to kind of ring that bell for us to say yes, and then to really connect the dots with how it does impact our lives. If we have children, what are they learning in school? Why isn't this in the books or the things that they're learning about? How can we do more of this? And we all know that, it's like if you have a family that you're very proud of because of all the things that they are doing, maybe in the community or whatever it is that you're proud of, it's the same thing with your culture. It's the same thing with your community. And by supporting the activism, by supporting those who are out there in the community trying to make that change, that is golden if members of the community step up or make your own path.
Right.
There are a lot of mamas out there
For sure, for
who
sure.
really make a difference in schools and things like that.
Yeah, it will come. It will come as we
And
continue to fight.
I,
If we look back now, we've come a far way.
yeah,
From the restrictions that they have put on us so far. We've come a far way, and the resilience keeps showing. So that's the main thing.
well, I will say that I am so moved by the larger movement, being a partner with the Alliance and all of the good work that's happening on St. Eustatius in terms of protecting heritage, cultural heritage protection, community gatherings and conversations. It makes me hopeful for other, areas, other communities. And wherever I go, because I work with other projects, I talk about St. Eustatius. I talk about the things that seem to work. I talk about the challenges of this work. But, St. Eustatius should be proud because you all have some serious warriors.
Yeah, and it played a key role in the slave trade as well. So
Yeah.
it definitely is a gem, as we call it. Well, in any case, I would like to thank you for being part of this podcast episode again.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure having you on, share the knowledge in your field, and also giving us some insight on the work that you have going on over there and other projects as well. I wish you all success in that as well.
Thank
And
you.
if there's anything you would like to leave a message for the public, the listeners,
I always say, keep on keeping on, but I look forward to being on the ground in November because I will get to shake the hand of Mr. Kenneth Kuvalet, who is a mover and a shaker, and Shamara Valentina. I mean, we're talking about some powerful folk moving some stuff on the ground. So I look forward to continuing to be a friend to the movement on St. Eustatius. And I hope to meet others. This will be my second trip. So I look forward to it.
Okay, great. Well, I look forward to seeing you as well. We'll be having our Statia week activities then, so it would be good to see you here as well.
Yes.
Forward to that.
I will be able to meet you in person, I guess, right?
Exactly.
Okay. All right.
That'll be
very good.
All right then. Well,
Thank you.
to all the listeners, this was another great podcast with Peggy King Jorde. This was yours truly, Ulysses Lopes. Look out for the next one. Thank you once again for joining us. My name is Ulysses Lopes, and you were listening to a podcast episode of the St. Eustatius African Burial Ground Alliance, reclaiming our stories, restoring our ties.